Hello everyone! Welcome! Welcome to another Tuesday night Eventide patron-only stream. Hi there, I am Jason Bowman. I'm the creator of Eventide and a little game called Pathfinder. And today what I figured we would get together and talk about is kind of the development of the lore and how the lore is being layered into the introductory adventure and how I'm using that adventure as a tool, not only to kind of have fun and have a good time with my players, but to also kind of introduce them and invest them in the lore of this world. And I think that this is a vital component of an introductory adventure. I think if you're going to have an adventure that introduces people to the world and to the setting, it's important that this is handled very carefully. You can, of course, just give the players a giant lore dump, right? You can just drop off on their doorstep a giant document filled with lore. And honestly, I did do that. That was part of the setup for this campaign, was to give them the player's guide and to let them, you know, take a look at it and read through some of the lore of the Eventide setting and try and figure out how their character fits into it. But even with that, I feel like that's a kind of dry, academic way of kind of getting the characters invested in the lore. The only things they're going to be invested with after that are the things that relate directly to their characters, and even then, those things aren't very real. They're just something that was read and something that was scribbled down in a backstory, and it doesn't really feel like a cogent part of their play experience. So, you know, when it came to designing Wolfren's Fate as an introductory adventure, I kind of wanted to make sure that part one, the first chunk of it, is really just a solid, fun adventure, right? I don't want to bury people in lore. I don't want to bury them in story necessarily. I mean, there has to be that to you know, suffuse the adventure to give it purpose and meaning, but it doesn't need to carry the full weight. First, I want to hook them. I want to hook them on having fun. I want them to get to know the characters they're playing, because that's the first person they need to meet. You know, when you sit down and you're playing an adventure for the first time, the first character you really need to get to know is your own character. And the first adventure is kind of there to do that. It you know, it provides a handful of NPCs, but not too many, and none of them are center stage. It really just gives the players a chance to interact with each other and to kind of figure out their group dynamics, figure out what they want to do. And all the while, they're getting kind of lore tidbits thrown at them. But none of them are anchored yet. They're just throwaway references and little moments. And honestly, they're just there to provide some background texture while the players work to figure themselves out. So going from that into part two, the job of part two is really to set up, you know, not just the next part of the adventure, but, you know, which is an urban adventure, but to also start kind of really introducing them to the world. It's the point where the world itself kind of really starts taking center stage. The first part of the adventure is entirely set within a dungeon. It's within a contained environment. And frankly, the rest of the world is kind of a formless box, and that's intentional. Because I really just want the players to focus on playing the adventure. In the second part, they've now got a whole city to explore. So, being an urban adventure, you know, they obviously need to get to know the city. They need to get to know the people in it and the power groups in it. But this also then is the first chance to really kind of start interlacing lore and story and campaign pieces and bring them all together in a way that the players feel invested in. And, you know, the old adage is show, don't tell. And I guess you could also say, you know, let the players experience it, don't just explain it to them, right? You know, so, oh, there's a whole bunch of lore about this world. Well, let them experience and interact with remnants of it and story pieces of it and characters of it. That's a lot different than just reading a piece of box text to them, right? So, and I think when you're doing this, right, when you're approaching lore in this way, there is an inherent feeling of like, am I being too heavy-handed? Am I, just laying it on thick to the point where the characters kind of glaze over and they don't pay any attention to it? And for that reason, I like to think of applying lore like applying the coats of varnish, right? You don't apply it all at once. You kind of do a coat, you let it dry, you apply another coat, right? So lore works best when they get it in repetitive kind of reinforcements and pieces that kind of remind them, oh yes, this is a thing. And there will come a point where they're like, yeah, we know. And that's fine. And that's when you've gotten there. But I do think it's best that, they're exposed to a piece of lore or a piece of information multiple times, because it really gets to stick. Players will forget something that happens to them once and then never again, right? In the first part of the adventure, there's a number of things that happen once, but those are the first mentions of a thing that then comes back again and again and again. I'll get into some examples here in a second. So, if you think about all these, first thing you're doing is laying down a bunch of kind of tent poles of important lore. Critical things, critical features that eventually you'll start tying together and connecting, kind of creating the bigger tapestry of the story. So, in the first part, right, we had a number of moments in the first part of the adventure. You have a number of moments sprinkled throughout the text and throughout the pieces that really are kind of without context and are just kind of there for the players to go, oh, that's a thing. It's a thing that is meant to get the word in their head. Like, oh, Eventide is a thing. It was an event. That was a thing that happened. Oh, gem trees, what are those? There's some lumberjacks who are going out to harvest them. But it's none of those things are super pivotal to the storyline. There isn't a riddle about Eventide in the first part or any nonsense like that. They're really there to just kind of start to get the words to be familiar to everyone at the table. You encounter the old elven tapestries. Those have lore tied to them. One's kind of a family tree. That's going to come back in. One of them is a picture of Ilsanvenir being beset by a storm of shadows. That's certainly very important, right? When they get downstairs, there's the strange cutting from, a treant, and there's, the letter to Queen Halfas. Halfas. Havras. Halvras? I've lost it here today. But the point is, there's a whole bunch of... Yeah, see, I don't even have it locked in. There's a whole bunch of lore pieces that are there to kind of just be mentioned. And then when you get to part 2, some of those pieces suddenly they come back again, and they get mentioned again, right? So I'm just looking at a lot of the places that the players can explore in part 2 and kind of what those mean and how they layer in the lore. So there's the Remembering Stone, right? So north of Wormbone, there is this stone menhir. This is how the elves remember their dead, because they don't bury their dead. Instead, they leave their dead to be reclaimed by nature. And as a result, they instead inscribe all of their names on a stone. That way they can be remembered. And, this giant stone, is basically just a giant headstone for all of the elves that lived in Ilsanvenir, and then after, and even up till today. The players are sent there because Wolfren's name is on it. And that's really odd, because he's not an elf. In going there, there's a number of things they can learn. Well, first of all, that someone petitioned to have Wolfren's name put on this thing. Okay, well, that's very interesting, and that means it was an elf. So Wolfren now has some tie to an elf. But if they look at the Remembering Stone and they make a check, they notice that there's a point about halfway down the stone when a whole bunch of names occur. Kind of all at once, and a number of the roots, the kind of family trees, just come to an end. And that's Eventide. That was when Eventide hit Ilsanvenir, and all of a sudden all these elves died. So in a very short period of time, a number of families just went dark. A number of elven families just got snuffed out because the Eventide hit this area particularly hard because it was the start of winter already, and then 3 weeks of darkness on top of that was a catastrophe. So when they go there and they look at this, they can ask the keeper about it, and the keeper will explain, hey, this is when, a bunch of elves died because, Ilsan Veneer was beset by a storm. And throughout this encounter, the keeper still refers to Wormbone as Ilsan Veneer, right? So it's little things like that are like, oh yeah, that's right. This city is actually founded on an elven ruin. And some of the elves still see it that way. I mean, there's very few left, but some still see it as that original city, even though it's mostly gone. So in that one place where they're just there to get a bit of lore, and eventually they can learn that the woman who petitioned to have the name put on there, was interested in the stars and said that she could not see Wolfren's name in the stars, so she wanted to remember him here. And that leads them to the Skygaze Inn, right? So it's a pivotal part of their investigation. But with that investigation, they get all the subtext and context around kind of Eventide and what that meant for the elves and what it meant for the community that was here. So they learn a bit about the city. They learn, again, a little bit about the central lore of the world. And it's all in the context of something that they're legitimately doing and investigating. It's not just dumped on them. It's something that is a point of note in something that they are already investigating. The key here is that if it's an active part of the story, they will latch onto it more. They may think, hey, this might be related, it might not. We should remember that. As opposed to just kind of like, yeah, that's a thing that got read to us at the beginning. What was on that again? Right. That sort of thing. So, this second part of the adventure is filled with components like this that either talk to the history of the town or the power groups in the town, or, start filling in Wolfren's background and filling out Wolfren as more of a personality than just the wizard that lived in a tower, right? Tower wizard is a very well-known trope, and adding something to his story is going to make it much more interesting and rich for everyone involved. So when they get back, and I now have experience with this because my players have started doing these pieces, right? And if we have a little bit of time at the end, I'll share some anecdotes about my recent playtest sessions. So, they get back to Wormbone, and, they run into the only gem tree in Wormbone. Because, right, Wormbone as a city is right on the edge of the gem tree forest. But there's only one gem tree in all of Wormbone. And the players are immediately like, well, why don't we just go find some gem trees and cut them down and make some money? And I'm like, well, they're very rare. And that's why there's guards around the one gem tree that is in town, because they don't want anyone to be cutting it down in the middle of the night. So, again, layering in part of the economy of Wormbone, the story of Wormbone, how this town controls a major component of the gem market in the north, because it has ready access to these gemwood trees, and its logging concerns keep track of them and help them grow and make sure that they're safe until they're ready to be harvested. And basically, what I'm laying down is, there's this site in the city where there are guards around a tree. And the players ask questions about that, and now, again, that's part of the story. And it helps that the House of Order is on that plaza, so the players kind of have to go there and witness this site. Now, again, they get to the House of Order, and now they get to start getting inculcated into the religion of the world, right? This is the first shrine or temple that they have visited, and the House of Order is a rather peculiar one. It follows very strict regiments. It's dedicated to Valanav, the god of law. And, they have to come at certain hours and perform certain obeisances before they're allowed to even speak to the high priest. And the high priest, when he learns about what they want, is like, yeah, I'm not giving you access to all of our logs. Those are all of our, holy records. Those are, they may seem like contracts and birth records to you, but to us, they are holy scripture. And, the only people who are allowed access are those who are faithful and prove their loyalty to Valanav. So the players get sent on a bunch of errands where they have to prove that they are not just, in it in it for some nefarious purpose. They have to go around and serve Valanav. So they're sent on kind of a... They're sent on a escort quest, basically. They have to accompany one of the priestesses as she goes around and does various tasks that are important to Valanav. So in this, they are earning the next component of their story and their mystery, because they want to look at these records to see if Wolfren had family, or to see if Wolfren, if there's anything in the records that might tell them more about Wolfren. But they can't get access until they do these tasks. And it's things like, go and guard the priestess while she gives a sermon to a bunch of people who aren't really interested in hearing her sermon. So they end up throwing food at the players, and it ends up being a bit of a mess. Another component of it is her going and delivering basically a commandment to the High Priest of Astramari to allow some religious fanatics to be part of the upcoming festivals. She wants nothing to do with it and refuses, and so it's starting to introduce the players to this group of religious fanatics, because there is a group in town who believe that all of the woes of the world are caused by people losing faith and not following religion. So the Church of Valanav supports these fanatics. The Church of Astramari, which is the good deity, does not. So she's much more down to kind of earth and much more about preaching, being good and being caring for those around you. And these religious fanatics are all about following law and order and tithing and following the proper rules and guides of faith, and that will bring the gods back. So the players end up escorting around someone who is in support of a religious fanatic, and how they react to that will determine how easily they get access to those records. And this reminds me, I need to put in a couple of exceptions into the mechanics here, into the story. I haven't run into it yet, but I suspect that I probably will. That if your group has a cleric of Valanav, that means you might get to bypass a bunch of this stuff. But the player character gets assigned a bunch of these tasks, so the player has to go do it instead. That's the twist there. But there's also the possibility that the players get shut down and they don't get access to this stuff. So the information in there is important, but not super critical. They can kind of find it other ways. So we'll see how that goes. But, that's just the House of Order. And it goes on, right? When they get to Blackleaf. Blackleaf is just a tea shop. But it's a tea shop that imports from all around the world, so it starts name-dropping other places. I had players playing in a game last night where, they wanted teas from various places. They wanted to test out their palates, so one of them was drinking green tea from Helenanthus, and the Penumbrist got some ashen tea from the shores of Valsampra, they kind of got teas from all around the world. Some went local, some went, they got teas from the university greenhouse gardens of Varnathus, right? So again, it's another layer of lacquer in the story of this region, of this world, right? So having part of the great thing about the kind of bullseye approach to the campaign's design is that I have enough information to name drop faraway places, to talk about, places that the characters may never visit. But I have enough information to give character to those places and make them an interesting part of the overall tapestry. They're part of the background that makes Wormbone come into focus. So, they go to this tea shop, and they've got a number of kind of old teacups in there, including, one of the first teacups that was ever drank from in this shop, which marks it as like 500 years old. And they, the tea shop is run by halflings from Helenanthus, and their last name is Coraltooth because they're from there's a number of different kind of cultural groups on Helenanthus, and one of them is the kind of seafaring and shore-living halflings, and the Coral-Tooth family is among those. Or at least they were, but now they've moved all the way to Wormbone, and they're actually the Coral-Tooth family actually owns a number of tea shops all over the world, and they kind of export teas all over the place. And it's just little things like, when they were drinking the tea, they were drinking, the character wanted a green tea. She asked for a green tea, and I'm not going to lie, I ad-libbed all of this, but I'm going to codify it. That's why I love running playtests, by the way, because it's giving me more lore for my world, right? In that, oh yes, green tea, the finest green teas grow in Helenanthus. And then he goes on to tell this story about, according to legend, should the rulers, the halfling rulers of Helenanthus, their feet must always touch the sands of Helenanthus, the soil and the sands of Helenanthus. And should their feet ever leave that sacred earth, they will lose their right to leadership forever, right? And he says, much like this tea, it can only be grown in Helenanthus, so we have to bring it here, right? And it's a tiny little nugget of a story to make the tea seem special. But it again reinforces this bit of halfling lore and story, because that is indeed true. Down in Bellcrash, there is a king of Wideland who is a halfling who walks around in giant metal boots filled with sand from Helenanthus, because he follows that tradition. So little things like that, talking about teas from around the world. Now, of course, this ties into Wolfren, right? Because Wolfren loved tea and used to buy all of his tea from here. And when they get a chance to look at all of the old books from the tea shop, they note that Wolfren used to get packages with his tea. He would have teas delivered from all around the world, and with them he would get books and correspondence and letters. They don't know the contents of any of these, but it's part of his research, and later on, it'll be revealed that he was getting first-hand accounts, or, in this case, fifth-hand accounts, of folks who lived through Eventide and what happened there when that occurred and stuff like that. Now, there's another note in the ledger as well that says that some of the packages were not picked up by Wolfren, but they were instead forwarded on to another location, which means they arrived in Wormbone, but then were sent out of Wormbone. If they were delivered somewhere in Wormbone, that would have been noted. But because it says they were held for forward, but no further information was given, that makes them a bit of a mystery. And according to the ledger, they contained plants, but not teas. Now, this is a clue that later on is going to become important, because they were actually being sent to Wolfren's brother, who lives in Red Thistle. And they were plant samples from around the world that Wolfren would sometimes acquire for his brother, who was a horticulturist. So this is just one nugget of lore, and it all came from a tea shop, which is fundamentally kind of a red herring of a location. If they don't go there, they won't actually miss any part of the story, except for all of this lore and backstory that's kind of layered into what is otherwise a red herring location. And again, this goes on and on throughout this part of the adventure. Every location has some elements of this. When they get to House Trevere, they learn more about the history of the city of Wormbone, but more importantly, they learn about its current political system, because they are going to go meet with the noble who is holding the noble seat on the town council. And he's kind of a slippery, slimy snake. He's out back when they arrive doing archery. And after they manage to convince the butler that they should be allowed in, they are taken to the back where they're interested in looking through his collection of old things. And he's like, well, perhaps, but, maybe we'll make a wager out of it. And he throws the match. He intentionally loses. But clever PCs will pick up on the fact that he intentionally lost, and that he's trying to butter them up and get on their good side, because they are the heroes du jour right now. So, and once they get a look at all of his documents and records, they quickly, if they're smart enough and clever enough and spend the time, can learn that he seems very interested in all of the old logging deeds and all of that sort of stuff, because he's gathering them all together, because he is trying to gain control over the majority of the logging interests in the entire region, right? So, that's his power play, and part of the kind of 9 spokes, which is the kind of conspiracy of 9 families, 9 powerful families spread throughout the North who are trying to control the entire North, and use it as a bulwark to kind of use their power and their money to keep Zankar at bay. And this then ties into the Upstart League, which the players haven't met yet, but they're going to, right? So again and again and again, this part of the adventure is all about layering in pieces of lore in ways that feel natural and part of the story, and not just, here, read this backstory piece. So, and honestly, it continues right up through the end, right? I haven't even touched on the Eventide festival itself. I'm still writing those parts of the adventure, but we're getting close to them. Like, I think we've probably got one session with each group at least before we even get to the first day of the festival. That's the ramp to the finale of part 2, is the Eventide festival. Because it's like Halloween, Memorial Day, and Thanksgiving all kind of rolled into one. Each one having its own kind of day in that order. So it's like Halloween, then Memorial Day, then Thanksgiving, right? So it's a harvest festival, a day of remembrance, and, a spooky night of fun. As a way to remember those horrible days, it's now turned into kind of a festival. So, and obviously that's going to be layered with lore, right? From, bells tolling for all the lives who were lost, to, people in spooky costumes, playing up myths and legends about Eventide, especially for this region, right? And then moving on to reading roles of those who were lost. And, like, one of my groups has already keyed into that, and they intend to do a memorial and a remembrance for Greyfawn Nimblebrow, the halfling that gets murdered in the first adventure, right? So it's actually genuinely pretty impressive how much these things have already started to get their hooks into the players, and how they're already starting to kind of buy into some of these elements. They're starting to talk about what their costumes are going to be for Eventide, right? For the first night, because it's a costumed kind of event. So I do think that this kind of approach is a great way to reinforce their kind of knowledge of the game, of the setting, and to get them to actually interact with it in a way that's meaningful, other than just, this is a knowledge check you made, congrats, here's the information, right? When they start realizing that it's a story that they are a part of, then, they will, it's just an investment issue, right? It's a lot more engaging from a player perspective when you realize this isn't just a story about history, this is a story that involves them, or will at some point in the future, right? So, it's really something else, and these things are going to continue, right? The lumberjacks from part 1, there was the lumberjacks in part 1 mentioning that they had a contract to go cut down a gemwood tree. Then in part 2, they see a gemwood tree, they see guards around it, they suddenly understand how valuable and important that is. They remember the lumberjacks from part 1 and they're like, oh yeah, those guys were going to go get it. In part 3, they rescue those lumberjacks who have gotten themselves into trouble while being out cutting down that gemwood tree, and will almost unlikely end up getting a gem from the gemwood tree that they cut down as a reward. So, it's kind of like a sub-story in this that comes to fruition. It's not important, it's not critical, but it is a part of this adventure that makes the whole thing feel more like one giant story and less a series of unconnected events, right? And that plays for a lot of the things in this. Some of these are honestly being put down as markers, not even for this adventure. Some of the strange things in Wolfren's library, those aren't going to pay off in Wolfren's fate at all, they're kind of markers that are being dropped for later, for a point in the future where once Wolfren is out and is trying to investigate things again and see where the state of the world is, and those bits of research were critical to his understanding. So the whole thing, frankly, is coming together rather nicely. I do want to talk a little bit about the 2 playtest sessions. So it's been tricky getting my groups to play over the past few months, to be honest. Just because of conventions and summer heat and people being out on vacations and stuff like that. But we're getting past that. As soon as we can get out of this boiling hot month, we should be in a place where, the games are going to be happening a lot more regularly and frequently. So I'm looking forward to kind of blazing through part 2 here in the next couple of months and have that done. I am hoping to release that adventure to all of you sooner than that. Because I'm writing it at a pace faster than they are experiencing it. It's been a little stop and go here, but yes, and I see that there's a question: is there going to be a piece of art of a gemwood tree? Yes, absolutely. In fact, I may even include one in part 2. I don't know. I'm still trying to figure out the art needs for part 2, and frankly, some of that's going to depend on how the sales go for part 1. So, yeah. So, my groups met a few weeks ago and played through kind of the interlude. There's, frankly, a chunk of this adventure that is specifically designed to be downtime, that is designed to be a pause and a breath and allow the characters to kind of, put their lives together, do some downtime stuff like that. I like including that as a part of written adventures to be like, yep, there's some downtime, There's a week that goes by between the end of the previous adventure and the start of this one. That's fine. So over the past week has been the first times that the players have now actually started digging into the investigation itself. So it's an open-ended investigation, right? They as I've talked about in previous patron streams, there's kind of 3 different components the players can interact with. There's location-based encounters. There's kind of free-floating encounters that are there for whenever the GM wants to sprinkle them in. And then there's time-based encounters that occur at certain points. Most of the time-based encounters are towards the end, dealing with the Festival of Eventide. The free-floating encounters, there's only a handful of those. And both groups have experienced one of them, but not the other one. That are currently planned. I think I have 2 or 3 more that are in the wings that I'm still putting together. And then they've done some of the location-based stuff, but they haven't done the same ones because they're different groups and they go in different directions. Now, they both groups did go to the Remembering Stone, although one group went there first, one group went there later. But one group went to the House of Order, another group went to Blackleaf, right? The first group actually went to the Skygaze Inn before they even knew they needed to go to the Skygaze Inn. They were just looking to kill some time, waiting for the House of Order to open, and they were like, is there a restaurant or something here in Gemtree? And I was like, yeah, well, there's a relatively famous one. So they went there. Funny enough, they went to the Skygaze Inn and tried to basically dine and dash because they're player characters. So, of course, they were like, well, can we just sneak out without paying? This place is really expensive. And not realizing that later they're going to have to come back here. In fact, they need to come back here to learn about the woman who, spoilers, was in love with Wolfren. And she is critical in finding out what happened to Wolfren's signet ring. And the secret to who she is and where she can be found is in the Skygaze Inn. So the point here is, the player characters went there and just caused chaos. And it may come back and bite them in the ass. Now, they didn't quite get a chance to, and someone did go and pay. So it's not going to be too bad. But, man, it was close, right? And I'm sitting there behind my screen trying not to lose it. Both groups went to the Remembering Stone. That was an entertaining encounter for both. They both fought giant bees. By the way, if you haven't noticed, following my games now, I've started posting up no context meme meme posts, about the games that I've been running. And, so there've been some B posts and some other oddities floating around in there. The first group talked about how, Hadram got into an argument with the owner of the teetering tower over a rug. And that was like, yeah, really that rug really tied the room together, right? That was that meme joke. So, in all of this, last week we did talk about reputation and boons. Yeah. And how they interact with people is going to affect their reputation, right? So, both groups also received a message that, they had the mini encounter. This was one of the floating encounters, where a member of the Waysong Guild, they're kind of the messenger group in town, approaches them to give them a letter and expects a tip. And I believe both groups stiffed the poor Waysong Guild member of a tip, which is costing them a reputation point with the Waysong Guild, because they don't tip. do that a handful of times, and you'll be unliked by the Waysong Guild. You don't want to be unliked by the Waysong Guild. They do message and package delivery, and if you want to get your stuff and not have it thrown in the fucking mud puddle, you better not piss them off. So, there's that. So yeah, and my group last night had the kind of very rich encounter with the Blackleaf folks. The other group is doing the House of Order stuff, and is going to actually is in our next session. We'll be doing the walk around with the priestess to get access to the House of Order's records. Yeah, it's worked out really well, and actually, while doing that, while waiting, because they can't go on the walk around with the priestess until 4 p.m. So that's when they decided to go up to the Remembering Stone, and they fought the bees and talked to the priestess, but that's where we cut it off. So they have just now realized that they need to go back to the Skygaze Inn. The other group did that first, and then went to Blackleaf instead of going to the Skygaze Inn. They were like, well, we should go there later when it's dinner or something. And they're kind of making plans about maybe we break in, or because they're assuming they can't afford to eat there. It's ridiculous, right? So I posted the meme from What's Always Sunny where he's doing all the planning and stuff. That was my players last night, just trying to figure out how they were going to break in to this inn and restaurant, because there's no way they could afford to eat there. They're far too poor. And, I not really realizing that the people there are perfectly nice and will just talk to the player characters, right? It's like they'll figure it out eventually. So all of these things have been tying together nicely. Getting my players to actually play these pieces, and watching them as they are engaging with this lore and learning more and more pieces of it. One of the things that's really interesting is that they are then starting to layer this into their own characters. At the tea shop, that group contains a human penumbrist who has the echo-touched heritage, which means he has distant relations that go all the way back to Volsampra. And when the tea shop owner mentioned that he had teas from Volsampra, he had this weird kind of reaction to it and was like, I need that. And, honestly, we don't know a lot about his character up to this point. I don't think he does either. So this is, again, a chance for him to experience a part of the story. And, he has some weird sort of ancestral PTSD about the place. And it manifests, right? The Echo Touch don't like sleeping in quiet places, because then they can hear all of the echoes of the past, and it disturbs them and prevents them from sleeping well. So, like, how that plays together with him and this tea, I don't know yet. I may write more things about the world that have something to do with this. That could be really interesting. That could be an interesting story hook to play with. And it all came from him just ad-libbing and monkeying around with this, right? So it's been fun. I certainly have had a lot of fun running the two groups through these things. And they still have so many other places to explore and things to do. There's an ambush coming up where some ruffians have been hired to eliminate the player characters, and that ties into like a criminal job board that's at a hidden bar out in the fields. right? Where criminals can go and pick up jobs. I kind of am lifting this idea from Deadpool, right? With, like, the criminal job board. And you know, that is, you know, a job got posted to eliminate the player characters, and it pays very well, and they're going to try and cash in on it. And when that fails, that's when the people who put out this job, who are the Gaunts, will, you know, move more directly. Yeah, sorry, I was just reading a few comments from chat there. I've got a couple minutes for questions and things here. I'll kind of talk to some of the things in chat. But yeah, that's what's been going on. There's been a whole bunch of memes about that. Some of those are just ridiculous, like the Scanners one. I believe the Bard in one group cast Daze on a bee and it critically failed, so its head exploded. You know, fun stuff like that. Took a bunch of damage and died, so its head exploded. I was like, yeah, it's just like Scanners. It just... and splatters you with bee goo, which I believe led to the getting slimed gif. Right? These memes are hilarious. One of my groups actually has a kind of a sub chat going while we're playing, where they just post memes about the game, which is pretty funny, which is what kind of inspired me to do it. So, yeah, I've got a comment in here about in any long-running adventure or campaign, it's important to allow players to develop their individuality as characters and achieve special things like building bases, research spells, etc., etc. Yeah, and that's building that into the story makes it so that the GM doesn't have to ad hoc it and can just include it and, you know, can expand it if needed or shrink it if needed, but it's in there, and the story... I oftentimes find that a lot of adventures, and I'm guilty of this in the past as well, kind of force a timetable, right? You know, there's a big ominous thing that's about to happen, and you better go deal with it right now, otherwise the world's going to end. And you're like, ah, but I was getting my sword enchanted. And it's like, well, I guess I have to go adventure without it. And it's not really necessary. The apocalypse could wait 4 days, right? You know, and the players could get their stuff done. I'm not saying you do that artificially. I'm just saying that as an adventure writer, you know, you can give the player space. You can give the story space to allow those sorts of things to happen organically, right? So, yeah, there's that. But it's been fun. Don't sleep near the memory stone by yourself. Yeah, no. Well, that, I mean... the remembering stone is there's nothing mystical about it really. Although some of the characters are like, one of my characters was like, "Oh, are you doing something big for Eventide?" And it gave me another chance for the elven caretaker was like, "No, I don't celebrate Eventide. That's not a celebration for me, right? You know, because that spelled the end of the elves. You know, for them it's not something fun." But, of course, people being people, they've turned, you know, what was once a solemn remembrance into a party, right? You know, that's what people do. And I'm I'm a big fan, personally, of the dichotomy between frivolity and horror, right? If you go back to, like, Crypt of the Everflame, the adventure where you're doing the coming of age story and they've got a fake dungeon set up for you, but then it turns out that there's actually undead in it and they killed a bunch of people. So you go there and it's kind of a ridiculous joke until suddenly it really isn't and there's dead people all over the place and undead are chasing you, right? And, you know, that's something that I find that contrast to be really palpable, right? So having the upcoming festivities where there's people out having parties and doing silly things, and in the middle of it, there's these creepy, long-fingered freaks stalking them, trying to kill them, right? That's gonna be fun. I'm looking forward to it, and at the pace I'm playing, it's probably gonna come close to Halloween at this rate. It's not true. It'll probably be in September, but it'll be close. You know. And, you know, that reminds me, I should definitely make sure to get this adventure out to all of you sometime probably in September, which means that all of you will have it to run for your groups right around Halloween. So that should be fun. Yeah. Well, thank you, Tiger Eyes. I appreciate that. Yeah, no, I one of the things that I've found is really interesting about this campaign is these chats are just a good way for me to analyze my own process, and a good way to share it with all of you, right? I think a lot of folks don't really have the opportunity to dig into how these things are built and just kind of assume that it just, yeah, you just write a story and that's cool, right? You know, and for some folks that is how it works. I've certainly done it that way, right? Where it's just like, well, here's my story. I'm going to go ahead and write all the encounters, and here it is. It's an adventure. But I actually think taking the time to be deliberate about your story beats, and not just treating it like, how do I make a bunch of balanced encounters, but how do I make a balanced story? How do I create an adventure that has good narrative drive, that has fun, engaging pieces, that mixes things up, that doesn't get stale, that, you know, there's a checklist of a dozen different things you have to try and do. And you can't satisfy all of them all the time, but you can, you know, make sure that the important ones are hitting when they're supposed to hit. And that's, you know, if you do your job right, everybody has a good time. So, you know, that's what I'm trying to accomplish here with this Haunted House Monster. That's a lot of fun. That's a fun job. I had some friends who did that for quite a while, way back in the day. So yeah, there we go. That's how I'm layering in the lore. Thin coats of lore until I get a nice rich color, right? I think that is the kind of key to making this whole thing work. And that's the focus of part 2. In part 3, that becomes a little lighter, but it changes focus from being all about Wormbone to being about the larger region, to being about the wilderness, to being about the kind of Icescar Valley itself. And then, you know, beyond that, you kind of come back and bring it full circle to kind of bring the story into focus and bring it in for a landing, which nets the characters a new mentor and a base and all sorts of stuff. So, lore baklava. Yeah, no, that's my strategy approach. Yeah. So, you know, I'm enjoying this. I hope you are all as well. I want to thank you all for supporting this project. Obviously, without all of you, none of this would be happening. It's not to say I wouldn't be running an adventure, but I certainly wouldn't be preparing to publish it, and I certainly wouldn't be preparing to share it with the rest of the world. So thank you. As always, thank you for being a part of it, and thank you for supporting it. So that's all I have here today. Yeah, well, I'm glad you're enjoying it, yeah. All right, folks, that's all I have here today. I got to get ready for my next stream, which starts here in just 10 minutes. We're going to be wrapping up Stray here over on Twitch. So thank you for watching, everybody. I hope you are enjoying this, and I look forward to sharing more of it with you in the future. The next Eventide stream, I believe there will be a Secrets of Eventide stream this Saturday. That'll be at 3 p.m. Not sure what the topic's going to be yet. I'll look around and find some interesting secretive stuff to chat about. Those are always a lot of fun. They're usually lore deep dives and explorations. Maybe we'll do some more of that. That's all I have here today, folks. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.